All righty, let me think. What else was I going to tell you? Whatever it was, it must not have been overly important. Today we're going to look at chapter 3, of course, because I'm OCD and 3 comes next. Deals with sensory systems, including things like your eyes and your ears and things of that nature. We'll take a look at a couple of dissection videos here in just a bit. I have yet to be able to find a eyeball dissection for a person that is not from a cadaver. I'd like, we got to look at a brain that was not in a cadaver yet. I haven't been able to find an eyeball for one of those, which just kind of blows. But anyway, we get kind of close. We'll get to that in a little bit. Anyway, there's a process referred to as transduction, which is what happens to the incoming information through your 5 senses. As that information gets into the body, into the system, transduction is the process through which that energy is translated into neural activity so that your brain knows what to do with it. There are a number of challenges that come up related to that, of course, depending on what's going on in your world. When stimuli change, of course, the response, the receptor response then changes. Some things remain at a constant level, other things increase and decrease depending on what's necessary for the transduction to occur appropriately. Now, one of the challenges that comes up related to transduction is being mindful that the information must be coded in some way. The human brain really and truly does function very much like a human computer. It receives information and then the brain codes it in some way that makes it useful, depending on what type of information it's receiving. That, of course, takes place via very specific nerve energies. Any stimulation, for example, related to the eyeball, whether it is from light or whether it's from eye pressure, will only produce the sensation of light. It will not do much else. Codes for the physical attributions of an object take on a different form of energy. So just bear in mind that each one of those particular senses, depending on the sense, may have more than one notion related to transduction. Temporal codes cause changes in neural activity. Spatial codes are represented by the physical location of neural activity, that sort of thing. Now, how does that help us when it comes to biology? Notions related to physical things. Your visual, your auditory, and your tactile information travels through the thalamus, not the hypothalamus, but the thalamus. Now that information then is contralaterally represented and mapped out in topographical representation, meaning the brain's going to take the information it requires, function, or move it to the appropriate side of the brain that's necessary for it to do whatever it needs to do, and then map it according to what's required. Then you've got regions of the primary sensory cortex that are divided into different types of cells and more complex processing of information through the sensory organs inside the brain, then adjust all that information through what's called the associative cortex. All of that boils down to simply say where I started. At the end of the day, the information gets into your system. The brain does magical things with it to make it do what it's supposed to do so that it is beneficial to you. It would be pointless if you received all this information, but your brain didn't know what to do with it, which then brings up the possibility of certain concerns related to information. What if someone's hearing is not appropriate? One's eyesight is not functioning as it's supposed to be. Anybody in either classroom colorblind? It'd be an interesting thing when everything is in varying shades of gray or another particular color, as far as that goes. I've known more than one individual who had color blindness that had to have his wife took care of making sure that the colors of his clothes, like his socks, were appropriately labeled in their drawer blue and black and brown or whatever else, because to him they were just gray. So if his wife didn't double check those things, he might have walked out with the wrong socks, which is just not a cool thing for those of you who are OCD like that. I knew an instructor years ago in a similar way. It's a process referred to as inattentional blindness. In the way he processes information. He came to school one day wearing two different shoes. One foot had on one side and the other foot had on the left shoe from a different pair. But noticeably different pairs of shoes. It wasn't like a brown pair and a black pair that are the same, two completely different shoes. Again, the process referred to as inattentional blindness. We often practice that process, or we don't really practice it, but it comes up a lot of times when we're driving. We miss an awful lot of sensory information when we drive because we're, I'm going to assume, somewhat focused on the road. For those of you who text, I'm not foolish enough to ask how many of you do. I'll be the first one to own the fact that I do when I drive, just depending on how much. You start to send a text and you'll realize about the time you have pushed send that you have missed something. You don't remember the fact that 13 cars have passed you going the other way or whatever else. It's inattentional blindness. It's all related to the processing of information. The human brain cannot, this is an important feature, the human brain cannot process all of the information that it receives all of the but at the same time, your ears are processing that information, your eyes are seeing it, but your feet won't really care. Some of you are twitching a leg or not twitching a leg. Some of you are playing with your pencil or your other writing implement or whatever else it is. You're not paying attention to those things, you're just doing them. That's simply because your brain is not focused consciously on those particular endeavors. The brain wouldn't be able to process that because the information is just too thick, too much to it. So let's take a look at hearing. Referring back to basic biology, there are 2 or 3 little bitty bones in the ear that are all affected by the pressure that's pushed onto the eardrum, which then vibrates certain sound waves into the eardrum. Then those 3 little bones work their magic, and it sends a neural transmission of some sort into the brain that tells you, oh, I'm hearing something. Wonderful question, and you may have heard of it before, and the debate continues to rage on. If a tree falls in the woods, nobody's there to hear it or to see it, does it make a noise? And that's not a rhetorical question.
No, not to us.
Okay, now, you just threw me all the way off. You said that, you just, okay, now, what?
Okay, there's a tree in the woods.
Okay.
Everybody good? Got a tree in the woods. All right. The tree falls over. Nobody saw it. Nobody was there. Does it make any noise?
It don't make a noise.
I'm asking if it makes a noise.
Yeah, it don't make a noise.
Why? How do you know?
Because it's going to hit something else, right?
Do what?
It's going to hit to something else.
It may hit something, but the tree falling, does it make any noise?
We don't know because we're not there.
It just makes a screeching noise in the tree breaks, right? Man, I know I'm not crazy.
Well, it's
Now,
not like light, so like technically, if there wasn't like light and like for reality, like how do we see shades?
I hadn't had anybody refer to it from the light perspective, but here's the fun part about this. I don't know, and I'll tell you why. First off, if there's not something or someone to see it or hear it, all it does is make sound waves, and sound waves are useless unless there is an eardrum to process them. So all it does is make sound waves. So theoretically, no, it doesn't make a noise if there's not anybody there to process that information as a noise. Now, again, it's a goofy question, but it does give you at least a half a second to pause and to give some sort of thought, however much or little, to how things work without people, or, yeah, would the squirrel hear it? Sure, especially if the squirrel was in it and fell out. Now, does that mean that I heard it? No, I'm not in the woods at the moment. I would not have heard the tree fall down. Now, when I've been hiking in Yellowstone or whatever, you hear all kinds of fun stuff in the woods, from branches breaking to animals to elk doing their racket, all kinds of stuff. There are certain things that you will see or smell or whatever. But again, if I wasn't there, are all of those things emitting all of their stuff that we would process from a sensory perspective? You bet. But at the end of the day, when it comes to our hearing, what ends up occurring is that the eardrum experiences those vibrations via sound waves. And in the process of all that, our brains take that information and make it what you and I would refer to as a sound of some sort. And those sounds are related to amplitude, wavelength, and frequency. Now, frequency is also referred to as hertz. Amplitude is about the sound wave and its loudness. Loudness is described in units that are referred to as decibels. How many of you wear hearing protection when you work with outside equipment of some sort? Sound waves, loudness is related to amplitude. Somebody, I think some folks murmured a little bit of yes. I have worn hearing protection outside for forever. Not because I had any hearing concern, but simply because I came across some information one day years ago that said, you know, it's probably a better thing for you to do that. But I've also developed a significant amount of hearing loss as I've aged, and lots of extra loud noise does not help it to any degree. So loudness is about decibels. To give you an idea of decibel ratings and what those noises actually are comparable to, okay. Heavy city traffic or even being in a school cafeteria is about 85 decibels. A whisper is about 30 decibels, a refrigerator running. How many of you pay attention to the racket your refrigerator makes? It's actually putting out 40 decibels worth of sound. A dishwasher, about 75. How many of you ever been on Subway? Subway in an actual city, the racket on the platform is going to be somewhere around 95 decibels. Now, MP3 players at maximum volume, and again, I'm not picking at you regardless of how loud you listen or don't listen, but for no more than 15 minutes of unprotected exposure at or above 100 decibels is not recommended. Once you reach 100 decibels, you're beginning to wander into the zone where it's possible to harm your hearing in some way. You happen to be in a big city where they're doing lots of construction work on the street. You'll hear jackhammers, rock concerts, symphonies, things like that are over at 110. When you have exposure of more than 1 minute without any protection at 110 or above, you risk permanent hearing loss, not some, permanent. An ambulance siren's 120, a jet taking off. I would suspect that the jet taking off even would vary depending on what part of the airplane you're on or in. But an average jet taking off is 140 decibels. A shotgun firing, it's 140 to 165. And again, 65 decibels ago, you've already moved into the zone where you could possibly damage your hearing. If you don't protect your hearing when you're working with equipment outside, I would strongly encourage you to do that. I'm sorry?
I can't hear that on my little eardrum. That's from going to a club.
And that's what?
That's from going to the club, standing.
Going to the beer joint. There you go.
Like it was ringing, and I was like, man, maybe it'll start ringing the next day. Like it rung like the whole day. Next thing you know, my whole ear just faded on out. Now I really can't hear it.
Sure. Now, the interesting thing, again, to me, it's interesting. Part of that's because I have hearing loss. I could take out my hearing aids, and when I first pull them out, it's as if someone has taken 2 corks and just put them in my ears. It sounds like I've climbed into a cave somewhere.
Yeah, I heard this.
It is now 13 seconds later. Is it fine? Yes, it's normal. But even hearing protection is designed, or at least hearing assistance, not protection, but hearing assistance is designed to simulate normal. In other words, what I hear when y'all talk to me, when we adjust for mask coverage and all that other kind of noise, or that extra barrier, in my ear, according to the way my brain processes that, it's normal. It's my normal hearing. Now, when I first started wearing hearing aids, it was a very different thing. Jessica turned them on. I'm sitting in her office at the hearing aid place. She turns them on and she spoke to me. And I yelled back at her, please turn them down, it's too loud. And she chuckled. She said, that's as low as they go.
Wow.
She said, that tells me how much your hearing has suffered for however long. She said, your brain has to learn how to rehear information appropriately. I walked outside and could hear the individual pieces of gravel cracking underneath my feet. It drove me nuts for about a day. Then it was fine. But as I've aged, and that's been, I don't know, 7, 8 years probably, give or take. Even when I make a hearing aid adjustment, I don't pick up on information like that. When I first pop them in the morning, it's like my ears are no longer stopped up, basically. But by the time I walk out of the bathroom, it's normal.
It don't affect your nose, you know, like sometimes with your nose and.
No, doesn't affect my smell at all. But I can tell you, you will often not realize if you have any hearing loss until you get your ears tested for whatever reason. I was having trouble in the classroom. Had a little bitty girl, I'm assuming she was in high school, but she might not have been. We were over in 309 over here. And she talked real quiet like this all the time. And I couldn't hear her to save my soul. I would step, that particular room has a center aisle and tables on both sides. I would start toward her so that I could decipher what she was saying, and sometimes would be standing at her table looking at her, which I'm sure made her terribly uncomfortable. But I couldn't hear her. And then my dad chuckled at me and said, you know, you might want to have your ears checked. Call Steve. So I did. And sure enough, I don't register the higher pitched female voice. It takes me a minute to process that information. The higher tones, I don't do as well with those. Lower tones, I'm much better off. I'm sorry?
Set the time in my left ear from driving a truck with the window down.
You'll find individuals in the military who are either in the military or have been in the military that have concussive type issues related to hearing, and they have permanent hearing loss. That's just the way it's going to be. Can they get some assistance that becomes helpful? I'm assuming so, but at some point hearing is gone. You know, if it goes away, that's all you got. Now, I'll ask you to think about it from this perspective when it comes to not being able to hear. Most of us, again, I'm assuming, when we consider the notion of being deaf, we think we don't hear anything from the outside. Most of us hear all kinds of things when our ears are stopped up. It becomes very loud in your head, does it not? When you're deaf, you don't hear that. You hear nothing, which makes some of the things that some folks who have been deaf have, the things they've accomplished, that much more extraordinary. Beethoven's a great example. Beethoven, you know, wrote some of the best music ever written down on a piece of paper, but after a certain point, he could not hear. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So everything that he tried to play after he had written it, he couldn't hear. So he didn't know what it sounded like. Now, could he feel, this is very important, could he feel the vibration of the music? Yes. But did that vibration get transferred through that process of transduction into something his brain understood as noise? No, it's just a vibration, which in my mind is somewhat freaky, not being able to hear. It's a very strange thing. Now, the ear has all kinds of extra stuff. The auditory accessory structures, the tympanic membrane or the eardrum, that produces a vibration that causes the malleus, which is also called a hammer, the incus or the anvil, and the stapes or the stirrup, to vibrate, and then we have that auditory transduction that makes all of that move in your ear. All that information gets processed and inputted into the auditory nerve. All of that has run through the cochlea, and even the little hairs, if you don't know this, get on a YouTube video sometime and look up earwax. And you can watch all kinds of videos of people pulling all kinds of strange funk out of people's ears, from bugs to rocks to earwax to, I mean, all kinds of stuff gets stuck in there. But the interesting thing about that sort of stuff is that the little hairs inside your ear also vibrate when sound waves go across them, which also influences your ability to hear. It's there for a reason. I'm not talking about old man hair that gets stuck out here on the side. That's not what I'm talking about. That's different. Yes, ma'am. Hang on.
I have a friend, she puts a, like, I guess she notices that she has a lot of like earwax in her ear, so she puts a candle. I don't know if it's in her ear or beside it, and then like after a while she'll just pull her earwax out of her ear.
Does she lay down? Does she lay down while she does it?
Yeah, she does. I don't know if she puts it in or how she.
The way it works, it'll look like a very, very long, normal ones anyway, a very long, very, at the big end, a real small ice cream cone, like a, you know what I'm talking about? But it'd be really long. And they put the big end, they rest it, people usually lay down on one side or the other, and they rest it so that this candle then sticks out and you light the end of it. And it doesn't always burn like you would think a candle burns, but the heat then reaches into the ear canal, and some of the wax then will loosen and actually come up into the part of the candle. And then there are other times, like she's mentioning, where it doesn't all come out, so she starts pulling on it and she pulls the rest of it out. Barometric pressure at sea level will also adjust how people's earwax produces and flows. When I was in the Navy, I walked up beside a guy in boot camp one day, and there was this big old glob of goo coming out of his ear, like, dude, what's up with that? You know, and he says, at sea level, I overproduce earwax, and it was literally running out his ear. You know, so the human body does all kinds of things to help itself. Of course, for me, I thought that was just the craziest thing ever, but I was also 18 and extremely foolish at that time. Now, did I look at him and say, oh man, that sucks for you? No, I just kind of chuckled and went on about my business, not to make his discomfort any more exciting than it already was. But your hearing is a very interesting thing.
Can you believe my daughter, I guess my last baby, she's 1, and she couldn't hear, like she failed every hearing test the day that she was born. To the point where my baby was definitely 7 months. They just put tubes in her ears last October. And like at first, when she first got the tube, it was hard. Like every time she heard the noise, she started crying. So she had to get adjusted to the tube. It was like, it was so bad. Like the way her earwax is so funny the way it comes out. But since she has the tube, it's so crazy. They said that she has to go back every 6 months to check them. And they said that they'll fall out. And
They'll eventually, yeah, the tubes will eventually fall out. Generally, they almost always do. But part of the reason for tubes inside the ears is also related to the buildup of fluid on the backside.
She had a lot of amniotic fluid in her ears.
And that fluid is what messes up. Now the fluid, now this is where we get to start talking about sinuses and hearing and all that. This is where those things connect. When there's too much fluid behind the eardrum, it will affect not only your ability to hear, but it will also in some cases affect your equilibrium. Your balance will get out of kilter, because all of that is connected in there. It will alter your sense of smell to some degree. I mean, when you get a real bad cold, you get all snotty, you don't smell as well. Same sort of thing. That's also related to fluid in your ears. Interesting stuff, generally speaking. Let me see what I got. I got I haven't looked at this video before, so it's always fun when we see one at the same time that I haven't seen before. Let's look at the ear. Now, I'm sorry you folks on the line can't see this.
The ear, which is an unusual dissection because you get a decalcified portion of the skull to work with.
I'll post a link for you.
So that you can easily cut right through bone even with the scalpel. Now we're going to start externally dissecting portions of the external ear to approach the tympanic membrane. And here you can see the external ear, the auricle or the pinna of the ear. And the first step in the dissection really is to dissect down through the external auditory meatus. And we've already made these scalpel cuts through the anterior wall of the external auditory meatus, so we can simply pull this segment of tissue away. We remove that anterior wall of the external auditory meatus, and now, as you look down into the depths of it, you can see the tympanic membrane right down in here. Very thin layer, which has actually got ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm layers forming it. And you probably can't quite see it, but the malleus, one of the middle ear bones, does attach directly to the tympanic membrane. So again, we see that at the depth of the external auditory meatus.
Now, just so you know, a regular eardrum will look somewhat cloudy. It's opaque, you can't see through it. It's healthy. It's when it's some other color that it's not healthy. So if you happen, if you happen to get online and start looking at this sort of stuff, you can't see it real well here. But a normal and very healthy eardrum will be kind of an opaque-ish white color.
Now we're looking at the ear specimen from the internal surface. We've got the cranial cavity inside here. This is the petrous portion of the temporal bone, which surrounds the structures of the middle and inner ears. Here you can still see the auricle, the external ear. Now, some of the things that you'll be looking for before you begin the dissection would be the internal auditory meatus here, where cranial nerves 7 and 8 both enter the temporal bone and pass toward their targets of the ear and beyond. So what you want to do as you proceed the dissection is to use a scalpel, again with the decalcified bone, and remove the roof over the internal auditory meatus, following cranial nerves 8 and cranial nerve 7 toward their respective targets. And we'll do that next. As we described, now we have removed the roof of the internal auditory meatus. We can see cranial nerve 7 here. And if I just reflect that for a moment, you can see the components of cranial nerve 8 as well. Now, because it's simpler, let's just start with cranial nerve 8. We don't have to follow it very far. As you can see, there are two branches here that are proceeding through the internal auditory meatus, and they will simply go off in their respective directions to innervate the cochlea and the semicircular canals or the vestibular apparatus. You can see glimpses of these tiny special sensory structures as you're carving down through the petrous portion of the temporal bone. That very tiny spiral of the cochlea is here, and if I put cranial nerve 7 back in place again, you may see some teeny little sections through the semicircular canals which are responsible for the sensation of equilibrium. Now, picking up cranial nerve 7, also going through the internal auditory meatus, you can follow it a certain distance and then it forms this T. Where that T happens is the location of a ganglion for cranial nerve 7. One branch from this point will head anteromedially, that is the greater petrosal nerve, parasympathetic branch of cranial nerve 7, which will ultimately innervate the lacrimal gland. The bulk of cranial nerve 7 will branch and continue posteriorly to the facial canal, which we've opened here, and that will provide the innervation to muscles of facial expression, as well as a variety of other functions. Now, we've also exposed the middle ear cavity during this dissection, so that we can see 2 of the 3 middle ear ossicles. This is the head of the malleus, and we cannot see the entire malleus. The remainder of it is continuing inferiorly and is attached directly to the tympanic membrane. Right here is the joint between the malleus and the incus, the second of the 3 middle ear ossicles, both of those being derived from branchial arch 1. Now, it's much too deep and too small for us to show you the stapes, the third of the ossicles within the middle ear. Another structure that we can show you, however, is a small muscle that attaches to the malleus that helps to control the movement of these ossicles as they vibrate. Here, running parallel with the greater petrosal nerve is a muscle called the tensor tympani. And its tendon will make a 90-degree bend and attach to the malleus to help reduce the vibration of the tympanic membrane when you hear very loud sounds. One other structure we'd like to try and show you is an important branch of cranial nerve 7 that we talk a lot about, and that is the Chordae Tympani. It receives that name because it travels through the middle ear cavity, essentially right across the tympanic membrane. Now to see this small branch of cranial nerve 7, what we need to do is pull out the incus, because that will give us better exposure into the middle ear. And we've got this strand, essentially, passing between the incus and the malleus as it cuts through the middle ear and then continues forward toward the petrotympanic where it exits the skull.
Always something.
Grammarly does more than count.
Okay, any other curious thoughts related to hearing or one's ears? I'm sorry, yes, sir.
When you're deaf, you don't have like the voice in your head? Is it just
Now, now you could take away your hearing, and you're probably going to. Everybody's got at least one voice, and no, just everybody has some racket that goes on in their head all the time. Some of us have a committee. Others of us just have one or two voices. That, by the way, you are not experiencing any sort of dissociative identity concern. You are not psychotic. You're not hearing or seeing things other people don't. It is a normal human function. And the short answer to your question, I don't know.
What about people born deaf? Like, what do they, how do they perceive?
They don't know any different. So the question, again, if you didn't hear, is what happens with individuals who are born deaf. They don't know that they don't have the experience of having heard. So for them, their reality is very normal. Now, there are some people who have certain sorts of conditions or whatever when they're born that gives them both. I know a young lady who was born without an ear canal. And because she didn't have an ear canal, she didn't have an ear on that side of her head. It was just a congenital thing. So, of course, she did not hear out of that side of her face. Now, over time, when she went to college, through a couple of programs that were available to folks such as herself, they did provide her with a Cochlear Implant, which then it's an auditory device that has basically some wires that get jacked into the appropriate places inside the ear, and then it has a little box basically that attaches to the skull. Longer hair keeps it covered up. Most folks don't ever know that she would have had one. And then it creates a vibration that the intent is for the brain to be able to process that as appropriate information. It didn't work real well for her for some reason, so it ends up being a wash. But they even built for her a prosthetic ear. They opened up her skin on this side. It was on her left side, I think. And they inserted magnets under her skin up against her skull so that the prosthetic ear would attach. But after they did it the first time, the magnets were strong enough, it kept falling off. So they had to go back in and put bigger magnets on it. But she has done miraculously well. Even not hearing out of one side, she's still done very, very well. Has a college degree, is a certified personal trainer. She does athletic training stuff for school districts. I mean, she's the bomb.
Does it look real? My wife had her ear ripped off when she was 17, and then she's a flight nurse, and her ear started to diminish, and she's freaked out about it. So does it look real? If
you're glancing at it in a hurry, as I recall, I never would have paid that much attention to it. Now, if I'm looking at it, it's like, yeah, it's a piece of plastic hanging onto the side of her head. But it's a good looking piece of plastic, I'll put it that way. But in the grand scheme of things, I hadn't noticed anything about her hearing until somebody actually pointed it out to me and said, she doesn't hear out of that side of her face. They get out of town. No wonder she always turns to look.
Yeah, my wife, when she goes to watch TV, she has to do that with this side so she can.
You'll see, and I've done it in class today, even depending on who's talking or whatever else, you'll see me turn one side or the other and make sure I'm getting it all.
What does it mean since y'all saying turn your head? The people's eyes, they be jiggling sometimes, some of the people, I don't see them keep it on my football. So my little sister did it for a long time.
Right.
I don't know what you call when their eyeballs get shaky, but they're looking normal actually. But you know what
Their eyes
I'm saying?
twitch like that.
They eyes, yes.
Yeah, I
And
see
then there's
that.
a kid on my football team, but the way he looks from the side. And I was wondering why he does that.
I can help you with that. Now, this will come
And I
up.
don't want to ask his parents, I feel like that's rude, but you know.
Dude, what's wrong with your eyes? Your eyes,
I don't wanna say nothing to him.
your eyes are twitching. What's wrong with you, man?
Yeah, I've seen a guy do that. He has to like turn his head like a bird, look at stuff.
Now,
But they turn from the side to see, but their eyes are still going.
now, I'll tell you what, now, and this will come up when we talk about sight, which we're going to get to in just a bit, but the eyeballs, both eyeballs have both a right and a left visual field. In other words, nope, what I'm saying, for those of you who have a textbook, there may be a picture of it in your book, I'm not sure. But each eye has a left side and a right side. Okay, now the left side, and for y'all it looks like I'm pointing to my right, but it's my left. The left-hand side of this eye and the left-hand side of my right eye, you still with me, are processed on the backhand right side of my brain. Remember we talked about contralateral representation? The right visual field and the right visual field in this eye, that information is processed back here on the left side. Now, the reason a person would change is that for whatever reason, adjusting one's scope of vision focuses, in other words, they end up excluding one field of their visual ability because it's twitching. And they can, by shifting their head, they can limit the difficulty related to that twitch. So then they can still focus on one particular thing. What you may also, if you ever are able to have a conversation with this person about that, you might ask them if they have trouble seeing things and being able to identify those things with their hands.
That's weird because he plays quarterback. Man, you really got me sitting here to hear this.
Now, and for example, I've forgotten which side, but if you can't see something, in other words, you've got a screen here and I can't see what's behind the screen, and you limit my field of vision to one side, left-hand side here, left-hand side here, and I may have it backward, but I'll be able to hold something, but still not be able to tell you what it is. And the same thing works the other way, depending on which side is doing which is why it's important for both sides of both eyes to work. And if one side or the other doesn't do appropriately, it can, in some circumstances, mess with your ability to identify things.
Wow. I was gonna say my mom has that for her eyes
Mhm.
twitch a lot, and on her left eye she can't see very well, so all she can see are shapes and colors a little bit. So she has to usually get up close to them, and most of the time she uses her right eye, but she doesn't like turn her face to look at it. She's able to look.
She looks at you normally
She's got it.
because both fields of vision are working in that eye.
But her eyes quit shaking when she got older. But you can tell though the way she look at things, she'll still cut her eyes sometimes.
You know, and I mentioned before, my father-in-law had issues related to his Parkinson's and had a microscopic twitch that you couldn't see unless you knew what you were looking for. Very challenging sort of stuff. Some other issues related to hearing and coding, how we process that information. Information is processed through what's called place theory. And place theory states that the hair cells at a particular place on the basal membrane respond most to the wave peak associated with the frequency of the sound. High frequencies are coded exclusively by the place where the waves peaks. What that's also related to is what's called just noticeable difference theory. And how that's described is, how many of you have ever had a formal hearing test? Okay, now they'll tell you when you hear whatever it is you're listening for, you push a button. Okay, the minute second you hear that's the just noticeable difference when the sound wave has reached enough amplitude that your brain processes that as hearing something. But before that, you hadn't reached that threshold of difference. So the just noticeable difference theory also is in play when you're talking about one's hearing. So it's between place theory and what's called frequency matching. Lowest frequencies are coded by frequencies and they're matching. Low to moderate frequencies are coded by matching and by the place. This also gives us volley theory, which is just another word for frequency matching and how those things process and work together. There's a whole, I used to think, there can't be that much. This lady's dissecting this ear for us, and I'm thinking there's an eardrum, an ear canal, the cochlea is in there, the 3 bones, and then she starts pointing out these 2 or 3 different nerves up in there that I have never even thought about. How all of those are then connected to something else that then help us process that information as hearing. The human body is a miraculous thing. If aside from the fact that if it were not so, we would have already figured out how to heal it all the time, and we can't do that. But there's a lot of stuff that occurs when we are dealing with our 5 senses. A lot of information is being processed, whether it's auditory, whether it's olfactory, making reference to your nose, whether it's auditory or whatever else. It's a very complicated dance, for lack of a better word.